In her research, director Nelda Castillo draws on literature, history, visual art, music, and dance to arrive, quote, at the quintessence of a text by means of constant distillation, end of quote. The staging of her réécriture into dramatic works of some of Sarduys' novels constitutes an ontological search for the Cuban character and its barroquismo criollo, or New World Baroquism. From Cuba with a Song is one example. Its characters typifying the three cultures that have helped to build Cuba, although they don't mention too much the native, but supposedly extinguished. So they typify the three cultures that have helped to build Cuba. These characters have neither history nor psychology, in short, no identity. The question of identity is also and even more explicitly revealed in her original piece, the director's original piece, Visiones de la Cubanosofía, Visions of Cubanosophy, a summoning of the island's historical, cultural, psychic identity as always in the making and forever resistant. This play is about everything: faith, power, slavery, prostitution, frustration, arrogance, dementia, hallucination, shame, creation, resistance, loneliness, abandon, and absence. The intertextual journey through memory in search of the elusive transcultural Cuban identity is built on Sarduys' notion of the need to find a nexus with the origin. Given that our greatest insecurity, cosmologically speaking, is that no explanation of the first explosion, the Big Bang Theory, justifies the inexplicable diversity we find in the universe today. Consequently, the mission of today's critic of the Baroque is, for Sarduy, to penetrate the model for the origin of the universe by means of identifying in works of art the imprint of that cosmological jump that he calls retombée, which he defines as an achronic causality where consequence may precede a cause, or in other words, an apparent similarity or resemblance in a time-space discontinuity. On top of that, for him, there's actually no hierarchy between the model and the copy, which is interesting. Benjamin would like that. With this notion, Sarduy exposed today's Baroque works as, quote, referring to vague images without an obvious emitter or addressee. Works we don't know of what, if anything, they are the retombées. Thus, like Beach Fowl's apparently multiple and elusive ending, Cuba's hybrid identity turns out to be a multifaceted and ultimately undefinable one. Humor forms an essential part of the island's spirit, and generally speaking, Sarduys' jocosity is a neo-Baroque one of parody and pastiche that has been described as an even more exasperating version of Cuban writer Guillermo Cabrera Infante's unique mixture of body excess and postmodernist wordplay. But Sarduys' weapon of choice was the typically Cuban choteo. Even more destructive than parody, choteo holds absolutely nothing sacred. In fact, the sacred tends to be its favorite target. Roberto González Echeverría finds that, quote, laughter and mockery are the masks of nothingness, but choteo, as a challenge to emptiness, is tantamount to a negation of identity. Based on the absence of the signified, the ruthlessness of Sarduys' choteo is not only rhetorical, but also formal. Contempt for the bourgeois expectation that writing should always have an explicit referent outside of language. To the same extent that Sarduy revels in language shamelessly, it is in his disregard for bourgeois mores and imperatives that he exemplifies what Bolívar Echeverría terms Baroque ethos. The Baroque ethos is one of the four ways in which human beings respond to the alienation and abuse of modernity's capitalism. The other three being the realist ethos, the romantic one, and the neoclassic ethos. The Baroque ethos represents the most defiant survival strategy to neutralize or endure the insurmountable contradiction inherent in the capitalist mode of social reproduction. This contradiction confronts, on the one hand, the use value of things as a social, transhistorical, and transcultural principle that Marx called natural, and on the other, the relatively recent logic of the value of things vis-à-vis the modern accumulation of capital that prevails. Besides making life acutely difficult for human beings, this opposition in modern capitalism is further advanced by its neutralization, a function whereby one of those principles is always subordinated to or subsumed under the other. Usually is the natural use value of things subordinated under the capitalist value on commodity exchange. In contraposition to the other three, Echevarria's Baroque ethos does not deny this subsumption or subordination, but neither does it find it inevitable. So each one of the four ethos has a different combination of, for instance, the realist ethos is the American dream. And so, the capitalist idea and accumulation and buying things and stuff, that is the main, that is the most important thing. The other one doesn't really matter. The other two, the romantic and the neoclassic, are both into, well, you can't really deny it, but I'll do my best. Like Jean Valjean, they mentioned Jean Valjean in the film yesterday. They drank to him, and I think he's the typical romantic. Well, I'll treat my workers. Capitalism is horrible. The mines and Les Miserables. I'll treat my workers as well as possible, and this and that, right? So they all have different combination of accepting that contradiction within capitalism. So in contraposition to the other three, Echevarria's Baroque ethos does not deny this subsumption, but neither does it find it inevitable. The main exponent of this ethos is Baroque art, not only as absolute decoration, as he mentions that Adorno called it, but especially for Echevarria as, and I quote, an absolute staging that has developed its own formal laws, a production that actually substitutes life within life, end of quote. So if the prevailing ethos in the history of the modern West is the realist ethos, epitomized by the American dream, the Baroque ethos is best exemplified in the history of Latin America. The low class, and I'm going to explain a bit how that came about. The low-class indigenous inhabitants of colonial cities who succeeded, 16th, 17th century, who succeeded in surviving the European genocide and weren't sent way out to the mountains or anything, they staged an informal and transgressive economic system as they adopted and adapted the very European capitalist system that was imposed on them. So they produced a sui generis mestizo reproduction that actually turned out to be completely different from the model. And I quote, una puesta en escena absoluta, barroca, la performance sin fin del mestizaje. An absolute Baroque staging or production, the endless performance of mestizaje.